Ranger dropped to his knees so suddenly that the metal legs of the chair beside him scraped across the emergency room floor, and every conversation in the trauma bay stopped at once. The veteran K-9 had spent years being trained not to panic, not to hesitate, and never to surrender control in a crisis, yet now his broad chest pressed against the cold tile, while his eyes remained fixed on the unconscious officer lying beneath the harsh white lights. 2 nurses tried to guide him away, but Ranger resisted without barking, growling, or snapping. He simply refused to move. Then the newest nurse in the department stepped forward, crouched beside him, and whispered one sentence so quietly that nobody else could hear it. Ranger's ears lifted. His breathing slowed. And within seconds the hardened service dog lowered his head beside the officer's hand as if he had finally heard something he had been waiting years to hear. Maya Ellis had been a nurse for less than 6 months, and until that moment, most people in the emergency department knew her only as the rookie who double-checked everything, apologized too often, and still looked nervous whenever a senior physician raised his voice. She wore plain blue scrubs beneath a faded jacket, her dark hair pulled tightly away from her face, and a small silver watch that had belonged to her father. Nothing about her suggested that she would be the person capable of calming Ranger when 3 experienced handlers could not. The trauma bay around them had become a world of controlled chaos. Monitors flashed numbers. Rubber wheels rattled over polished floors. A ventilator hissed steadily beside the bed. Somewhere beyond the doors, phones rang and footsteps hurried across the corridor, but inside the room everyone had become strangely aware of the dog. Ranger was not an ordinary hospital visitor. He was a veteran K-9 with years of field experience, trained to remain composed around gunfire, crowds, sirens, blood, and confusion. His handler, Sergeant Daniel Cole, had been brought in after a serious roadside incident less than 20 minutes earlier. The details were still unclear. One moment he had been responding to a call, and the next he had been found injured beside his vehicle. Ranger had been with him when emergency crews arrived. The dog had followed the ambulance all the way to the hospital and had refused every attempt to separate him from his partner. Now Daniel lay unconscious, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights, one arm resting motionless against the sheet. Dr. Harris, the senior emergency physician, glanced toward Ranger with visible frustration. "We need the dog out," he said. Nobody argued. Everyone knew he was right. But when a technician approached, Ranger stood and blocked the side of the bed. His body was rigid. His eyes never left Daniel. The technician stopped. "He won't let us near him." "Then get his handler," Dr. Harris said. "We already called." A nurse whispered that Sergeant Cole's regular backup handler was still several minutes away. Every second mattered. Maya stood at the edge of the room holding a tray she no longer remembered picking up. She watched Ranger carefully. Something about his behavior bothered her. It was not aggression. It was fear. She had seen fear in patients before. She had seen it in children, in elderly people, in families waiting outside operating rooms. Fear made people cling to familiar things. It made them resist hands that were trying to help. But Ranger was not looking at the medical staff. He was looking at Daniel's hand. More specifically, he was staring at the small leather band around Daniel's wrist. Maya noticed it because the band had shifted during treatment, revealing a tiny metal tag underneath. She could not read what was engraved on it from where she stood. Ranger gave a quiet whine. Maya took one step closer. "Maya!" Another nurse warned softly. "Don't." She stopped. "He isn't trying to hurt anyone." "I know. But you don't know him." That was true. Maya did not know Ranger. She did not know Sergeant Cole. She did not know why the dog's right ear carried a small notch near the edge or why a pale scar disappeared beneath his collar. But she knew what it looked like when someone was waiting for permission to be afraid. Maya slowly set the tray down. Dr. Harris turned toward her. "What are you doing?" She did not answer immediately. She crouched several feet away from Ranger and lowered herself until they were almost at eye level. The dog watched her carefully. His breathing was still fast. Maya noticed the scar beneath his collar again. It was older than she had first thought, a thin white line disappearing beneath the dark fur. There was something familiar about the way he held his head. Not the breed. Not the training. Something else. A memory she could not place. Her father's voice came back to her from years earlier, faint and distant, from a time when she had been a child sitting at a kitchen table while he polished an old pair of work boots. He had once told her that animals remembered the people who treated them gently, even when people convinced themselves that animals forgot. Maya had laughed at him then. She did not laugh now. Ranger took one cautious step toward her. The room remained silent. Maya extended her hand but stopped before touching him. "It's okay," she whispered. Ranger's eyes shifted briefly toward Daniel, then back to her. Maya swallowed. She could hear the monitor beside the bed. Beep. 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 The rhythm was steady, but Daniel's condition was not. Dr. Harris was preparing to move him. The dog would have to be separated from him. Maya knew that. She also knew Ranger was not going to make it easy. She leaned forward slightly and whispered the sentence that had been buried in her memory for most of her life. "You can let him go for now." The words were barely audible. Ranger froze. His ears lifted. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the dog's rigid posture softened. His head lowered. His front legs folded beneath him. And the veteran K9 dropped to his knees beside the unconscious officer. Nobody spoke. Maya felt her own heartbeat pounding against her ribs. Ranger slowly moved his paw forward until it rested against Daniel's hand. Dr. Harris stared at the scene, then looked at Maya. "What did you say to him?" Maya did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on the small metal tag beneath Daniel's wristband. Now that she was closer, she could finally see the engraving. It carried a name she recognized. Not Sergeant Cole's. Not Ranger's. A name she had not heard spoken in years, a name connected to the same old story her father had refused to finish telling her. Maya's face changed. The room seemed to grow colder. Ranger looked up at her again, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, the veteran K9 did not look confused or frightened. He looked as if he recognized her. And Maya suddenly understood that whatever had brought Ranger to his knees had nothing to do with the emergency room at all. It had started long before tonight. Dr. Harris asked the question again, but Maya still could not answer. The metal tag beneath Sergeant Cole's wristband had turned slightly, catching the fluorescent light, and the name engraved across it seemed to pull a memory from somewhere deep inside her. Ranger remained beside the bed, his paw resting against Daniel's hand, perfectly still now. The same dog who had resisted 3 trained handlers had surrendered to a sentence spoken by a rookie nurse. That alone would have been strange enough. But Maya knew the name on the tag. She had heard it years ago from her father, usually late at night, when he believed she was asleep. It belonged to a man named Thomas Reed, a former K9 handler who had disappeared from their lives after a field operation went wrong. Maya's father had never explained exactly what happened. He had only told her that some promises were too painful to keep talking about. Now that name was lying beside an unconscious police officer and a veteran K9 who seemed to recognize her voice. "Maya," Dr. Harris said more firmly, "what did you say to him?" She looked at Ranger. "I told him he could let him go for now." The doctor frowned. "Why those words?" Maya hesitated. "Because my father used to say them." That answer created more questions than it solved. Before anyone could ask another, the monitor beside Daniel changed. His heart rate climbed sharply. Nurses moved around the bed. Dr. Harris ordered medication and prepared the team for surgery. Ranger stood immediately, but instead of blocking them, he stepped aside. That frightened Maya more than his earlier resistance. It was as though he understood that Daniel had to leave him. The doors opened. The stretcher began moving toward the surgical corridor. Ranger followed until a security officer gently stopped him. The dog did not fight. He simply watched Daniel disappear behind the doors. Then he turned back toward Maya. His eyes held hers for several seconds before he lowered his head. The room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but nobody in it felt normal anymore. Maya knew she should return to her duties. She knew she was already attracting too much attention. She also knew something about Ranger was wrong. Not medically. Emotionally. He was grieving before anyone had told him that he might lose his partner. She sat on the floor several feet away from him, keeping her voice low. You knew him before Daniel. Ranger's ears moved. Maya looked at the scar beneath his collar. Didn't you? Ranger remained silent. Of course he did not understand every word. But animals understood tone, rhythm, intention. And Maya had learned long ago that sometimes people revealed themselves by the way they reacted to silence. She remembered her father again. He had been a quiet man, never comfortable discussing his work. When Maya was young, he had kept an old photograph in a drawer beneath his clothes. She had found it once by accident. In the picture, a younger man stood beside a K9, one hand resting against the dog's shoulder. She had asked who they were. Her father had taken the photograph from her and put it away. He had only said, "That dog saved someone who couldn't save himself." Maya had never forgotten the sentence. Now she wondered whether Ranger was that dog. A hospital administrator entered the room and asked why the K9 was still there. The answer was simple. Sergeant Cole was his handler, and until another authorized handler arrived, Ranger was not being removed without a reason. But the administrator did not care about old stories. She cared about liability. He needs to leave the treatment area, she said. Maya stood. He should stay. Everyone looked at her. You don't understand, she continued. He's not interfering anymore. You're a nurse, not an animal behavior specialist. The words were not cruel, but they carried the weight of authority. Maya felt the familiar pressure in her chest, the feeling she had known since joining the hospital. The feeling that came whenever someone reminded her that she was new. She could step back. She could let the professionals decide. Or she could trust what she had seen. She looked at Ranger. He was staring at the surgical doors. Give him 10 minutes, she said. The administrator shook her head. That isn't your decision. Maya knew she was right. Yet before she could move, Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward the doors. He stopped directly beneath the red surgical light and looked back at Maya. There was something almost pleading in his expression. She followed. The administrator called after her, but Maya kept walking. Then she noticed something on the floor. A tiny piece of fabric had fallen from Sergeant Cole's uniform during the transfer. Maya picked it up. It was not ordinary cloth. It was part of an old embroidered patch. On it was the same name engraved on the metal tag. Thomas Reed. Maya's fingers tightened around it. Ranger stared at the fabric. Then he made a sound she had not heard from him before. A low, broken whine. Maya crouched beside him. You remember him? Ranger lowered his head. Maya closed her eyes. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. Her father had known Thomas Reed. Thomas Reed had been connected to Ranger. Sergeant Cole had carried Thomas's name on his wrist. And Ranger had responded to a sentence Maya had learned as a child. But there was still one question. Why had her father taught her those words? The answer came later that evening when an older man arrived at the hospital wearing a retired police jacket. His gray hair was thin, his shoulders slightly bent, but Ranger recognized him immediately. The dog walked straight toward him and stopped. The man looked at Ranger, then at Maya, and his expression changed completely. Where did you hear that sentence? He asked. Maya stared at him. My father taught me. The man's face went pale. Your father? Daniel knew him, Maya said. Didn't he? The older man looked toward the operating room. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he finally answered. Your father wasn't just connected to Thomas Reed. Maya's breathing stopped. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a younger ranger standing beside two men. One was Thomas Reed. The other was Maya's father. But there was something else in the photograph that made Maya's hands tremble. In the background stood a much younger Sergeant Daniel Cole, watching them from several feet away. Daniel was there that day, the old man said quietly. He was the rookie. Maya stared at the photograph. Her entire understanding of the night shifted. Daniel had not simply been Ranger's handler. He had been part of the story her father had spent years refusing to tell. And Ranger had not dropped to his knees because Maya had somehow discovered a magical command. He had responded because those words belonged to a promise made long before Maya ever became a nurse. The older man looked at her and lowered his voice. Your father made that promise after Thomas was killed. Maya looked toward the operating room. What promise? The old man hesitated. Then he said the words that changed everything. He promised Ranger that if the day ever came when the dog had to let someone go, someone who knew the old command would come back and tell him it was safe. Maya looked down at Ranger. The veteran K9 was sitting quietly beside her now. And for the first time, she understood that the sentence she had whispered was never really meant for a dog. It had been meant for a survivor. For a few seconds, Maya could not speak. The old photograph trembled between her fingers, and Ranger remained beside her with his head lowered, as though he had finally found the one person who could carry a promise that had outlived everyone who made it. The older man introduced himself as Frank Mercer, a retired handler who had worked with Maya's father and Thomas Reed years earlier. He explained that Ranger had not always been Sergeant Cole's partner. Before Daniel, he belonged to Thomas. Thomas had trained him from the beginning, teaching him the discipline that made Ranger legendary and the quiet trust that allowed the two of them to work as one. Then came the operation that changed everything. Thomas never came home. Ranger survived, but afterward he stopped responding normally to unfamiliar commands. Daniel was the young officer assigned to work with him, and it took months before Ranger accepted another handler. Even then, something remained unfinished between the dog and the man he had lost. Maya listened without interrupting. She finally understood why the scar beneath Ranger's collar had felt familiar. Her father had shown her that scar in an old photograph when she was a child. He had told her never to be afraid of an animal that looked frightened, because fear could be a sign that something precious was being protected. He had also taught her one strange sentence. You can let him go for now. At the time, Maya had thought it was simply something adults said when saying goodbye. She never knew it was a command created for Ranger. Her father had promised Thomas that if Ranger ever became trapped between loyalty and grief, someone would tell him that letting go did not mean forgetting. Maya looked toward the operating room. Daniel was still fighting for his life. Suddenly the old story was no longer a story. It was standing beside her. Ranger had recognized the words, but he had also recognized something in Maya's voice. Perhaps the rhythm. Perhaps the memory carried in it. Perhaps the impossible connection between two people who had never met, but had been shaped by the same absence. Frank touched Maya's shoulder. Your father kept the promise. Maya looked at him. How? Frank nodded toward the photograph. He made sure the words survived. The operating room doors opened. A surgeon stepped into the corridor, and everyone turned. Daniel had survived the surgery, but the next several hours would be critical. Maya felt the tension leave her body all at once. She closed her eyes for a moment. Ranger stood beside her. He had not moved toward the surgeon. He simply watched Maya. Then, slowly, he rested his head against her knee. It was such a small gesture that nobody else in the corridor seemed to notice. But Maya did. She placed one hand gently on the top of his head. He's still here, she whispered. Ranger's eyes closed. For the first time that night he looked peaceful. The story could have ended there. A rookie nurse had calmed a veteran K9. A wounded officer had survived. An old promise had finally been fulfilled. But the truth was quieter than that. Maya had spent her entire nursing career believing that experience meant knowing exactly what to do. That night taught her something different. Experience could tell you what usually happened. Compassion could make you notice when this moment was different. The next morning, Daniel opened his eyes. His first question was not about his injuries. It was about Ranger. Maya stood beside the bed when he asked, "Is he okay?" She smiled faintly. "He's been waiting for you." Daniel turned his head toward the doorway. Ranger entered with Frank and stopped when he saw him. For a moment neither moved. Then Daniel lifted his hand. Ranger approached slowly and placed his muzzle against it. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "He hasn't done that since Thomas," he whispered. Maya said nothing. She did not need to. Daniel looked at her. "How did you calm him?" Maya glanced at Ranger. "Someone taught me the words." Daniel stared at her. "Who?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old photograph. Daniel looked at it and went completely still. His eyes moved from the photograph to Maya's face. "Your father," he said. Maya nodded. Daniel closed his eyes. For several seconds the room was silent. Then he told her what her father had never been able to explain. Years earlier, after Thomas died, Maya's father had helped Daniel earn Ranger's trust. He had stayed with the dog through the worst nights, even when Ranger refused food and would not sleep. He had told Daniel that Ranger did not need another master. He needed someone who understood that loyalty was not something you replaced. It was something you carried. Eventually Ranger accepted Daniel. They became partners. They became family. But the promise remained. If Ranger ever faced the same kind of loss again, someone had to tell him that he was allowed to release the burden. Maya looked down at her father's watch on her wrist. Suddenly it felt heavier than it had that morning. Daniel noticed it. "He gave you that?" Maya nodded. Daniel smiled sadly. "Then he gave you more than a watch." Maya understood. Her father had spent years carrying memories he could not explain because some stories were not meant to be told all at once. Some were meant to survive quietly until the right person was ready to understand them. Later that afternoon, Maya walked into the hospital courtyard with Ranger. The morning sun had replaced the cold fluorescent lights, and for the first time she could see the small white scar beneath his collar clearly. Ranger sat beside her. Maya looked at him and realized that she had spent the night thinking she had saved him. She had not. He had simply trusted her enough to show her what he had been carrying. That distinction mattered. People often believed strength meant holding on no matter how heavy the burden became. But sometimes strength was knowing when another person had arrived to help carry it. Maya rested her hand against Ranger's shoulder. He leaned gently into her. No dramatic command followed. No crowd applauded. No one took a photograph. There was only a nurse, a veteran dog, an injured officer slowly recovering, and an old promise finally allowed to rest. Months later, Daniel returned to duty. Ranger remained at his side. Maya continued working in the emergency department, still checking everything twice, still learning, still sometimes doubting herself when the senior nurses moved faster than she did. But she never again mistook being new for being incapable. And whenever someone asked how she had managed to calm a K9 that 3 experienced handlers could not control, she never gave them the whole story. She would simply smile and say that sometimes the right words are not powerful because they are loud. They are powerful because someone has been waiting a lifetime to hear them. That was the truth Maya carried with her after that night. The smallest voice in the room can sometimes reach the deepest place. Not because it knows more than everyone else, but because it listens closely enough to hear what everyone else has missed. And perhaps that is why some moments change us without making a sound. They remind us that kindness is not always an extraordinary act performed by extraordinary people. Sometimes it is a quiet sentence spoken at exactly the moment someone has forgotten they are allowed to let go. If this story stayed with you, carry that thought into your own day, And when you see someone struggling silently, remember that the right words do not always need to be grand. Sometimes they only need to arrive when they are needed most. And long after the hospital lights faded behind them, Ranger walked beside Maya beneath the morning sky, carrying his memories a little more lightly, while she carried the quiet certainty that some promises can wait for years before the right person finally comes to keep them.